Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris, and this week I have a short, we'll call it bite-sized episode for you. It's been my birthday week and I needed a little time to myself, but I think I do have an interesting story to share with you. It involves a lawsuit and lost media. This is a case of Marvel Comics getting in a lawsuit, but here's the thing. This is the Marvel Comics of the mid-1980s, not the Marvel of today. So they weren't part of some massive Disney conglomerate. They were much more modest. They're the underdog in this story. So what's bigger than, a company? Outer space. The year was 1984, and Ronald Reagan's White House put together the idea for a program that would interest the youth of America in math and science. The White House announced, with Drew Barrymore fresh off of E.T. the Extraterrestrial fame, the new program. It was run by a new nonprofit organization called the Young Astronauts Council, the YAC, and they worked hand in hand with NASA to excite kids about science. One of the YAC's first partnerships was with Marvel Comics. The partnership called for Marvel to make comics and magazines using YAC's logo and trademarks, as well as acting as their exclusive representative to negotiate licensing agreements. In 1985, the two parties entered into an agreement for Marvel to develop and produce an animated television show based on YAC. Ads for the YAC began appearing in Marvel's September 1985 comics. They showed Captain America and some kids looking to space with the slogan, "Reach for the Stars." There were also ads mentioning a Saturday morning cartoon Marvel had developed called The Young Astronauts, which was to air on CBS in September of 1985. According to comics writer and artist Walt Simonson, issue 255 of Thor by Marvel Comics was even brought up into space aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger for their July 1985 mission. So was a can of Pepsi, which Marvel had brokered a deal with. The cartoon advertised apparently only aired once on Saturday morning, January 25th, 1986. The images I'm using in this video are the few remaining bits to prove that it existed, because the agreement between Marvel and YAC eventually fell apart and this media does not exist anymore. There are a few animation cells owned by collectors, some promotional art by Rudy Nebres, and the ads themselves. The premise was to involve the Hampton family, consisting of Captain Kelly and her co-pilot and husband, Jason. They have 3 children, Wendy, Rick, and young Mikey with his cat Rascal and robot sidekick Retro. The YAC wanted the show to display a realistic look at life in space in the 21st century. But Marvel and CBS wanted to make it more of an entertaining sci-fi show for kids. The YAC objected to the pilot, but when CBS said they wouldn't pick up the show the way YAC wanted, they relented and let it progress. However, on January 28th, just 3 days after the pilot was shown, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. It was a national tragedy, and CBS immediately canceled the cartoon. One of the few remaining pieces of evidence that it existed were some public service announcements called the Astro Minute that had been created with NASA for the show, but which were instead aired during episodes of Richie Rich. I remember watching the Challenger disaster live on television in school on Tuesday. Very depressing. It sincerely eliminated my interest in outer space for a while, so I don't blame CBS for walking away from that cartoon at that point in time. It just wasn't the right time to do it. Back to the story with Marvel and the YAC. In March of 1986, the two parties agreed to modify their agreement such that Marvel was no longer the exclusive licensing representative. But Marvel was like, hey, we introduced you to Pepsi and McDonald's, where's the money from that? The YAC was not forthcoming, so Marvel actually sued them in 1988. The YAC argued that Marvel had failed to produce a cartoon or a comic book, but the court ruled that Marvel wasn't obligated to make the show happen. That would be up to the broadcaster. Marvel had fulfilled its obligation to put together a show and do their best to sell it. There was also plenty of evidence Marvel had a comic book in the works before YAC terminated their agreement. The January 1986 issue of Marvel Age had a 2-page article about the upcoming Young Astronauts comic, which had a team including writer Denny O'Neil and penciler June Brigman. In March, Marvel ran an ad for the upcoming comic in their titles. But the cartoon was meant to drive everything else, and after the shuttle disaster, that cartoon went away. However, some of the licensing arrangements Marvel set up did see the light of day eventually. For instance, by 1990, McDonald's did release several Happy Meal toys based on the Young Astronauts Council. Ultimately, the court found everything in Marvel's favor, and Marvel was entitled to the fees that they'd earned from these partnerships, which added up to about $200,000. That was on top of a summary judgment from a couple years earlier, where the courts gave Marvel $75,000 from the YAC, and also Marvel was entitled to reclaim all their legal fees from the YAC. So, yeah, Marvel defeated a non-profit organization. Okay, this isn't much of a victory for anybody. It's more of a weird story. And the only evidence that this existed is very, very small. This is definitely a case of lost media, because the cartoon was only aired once. It's not on any physical media. The comic book was probably made, but definitely never released. There's just ads for it. The only lasting evidence that this Marvel partnership existed with the YAC are two things. One, that issue of Thor number 355 went up into space, and some retired vice president from Marvel has that framed. And two, there are some Happy Meal toys, and that was because Marvel introduced McDonald's to the YAC. And that's it. Just a unique case of lost media and Marvel Comics defeating a non-profit. Thanks so much for listening, folks. I have a bigger, much more in-depth episode coming for you next week, so I just needed a little more time for that as well. But thank you so much for watching. Please, if you have a moment, hit things like and subscribe. That really helps the channel. I'll see you next week. Until then, I want you to keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.